Week 3 of the protests in Brazil, they continue to take their toll, and nowhere is that toll stronger than in the approval ratings of Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil. A survey was done 3 weeks ago and today by Brazil's largest newspaper, and her approval ratings have tanked. They have gone from 57% prior to the protests, which is actually not that bad, down to 30% earlier today, losing almost half of her approval. And specifically, these are people saying that they think that the government is doing a good or a great job. Now, to put that in some American context, for instance, President Barack Obama over the past few months has had both the IRS scandal, the appease scandal, the NSA wiretapping, the data mining. There's still lingering questions over Benghazi if you're watching Fox News. All of those scandals, and he's lost 10% of his support, perhaps. But no, in Brazil, much stronger reaction coming out of those protests. As we said, about half of her approval. Now, if you're not familiar with the nature of these protests, they started a few weeks ago, and the initial impetus for them was some hikes in public transportation fees that Brazilians had major problems with. But similar to the protests in Turkey, what started as a very simple issue in response to one policy that was being pursued has now widened to include a number of different concerns, including government corruption, high taxes, poor public services, and the many billions of dollars that are being spent on next year's World Cup soccer tournament and also the 2016 Olympics that are going to be held in Rio. Now, more widely in Brazil, these protests are not just popular amongst the people protesting, which are incredibly large crowds, by the way. We've got some pictures for you. 81% polled by that large newspaper said that they support the nature and the goals of the protests. And what's interesting about this, we obviously started with the focusing on the drop in approval ratings for the president, but it's going to be an interesting question to see going into, I believe they have their next election next year, if it's going to take a real toll on her then, since it's not her specifically that is being hurt by this, but generally the entire government, all the parties concerned. The Brazilians tend to have a problem with all of them. We've got a quote from Pedro Arruda. He's a professor of political science at Catholic University in Sao Paulo. He says, the protest movement that began 2 weeks ago isn't necessarily a movement against the ruling Workers' Party, nor Dilma herself. It's a protest against the entire ruling class. The people are protesting all the parties. And so that's interesting. I mean, I think we've seen something like that in America. The Occupy protest that went on did have a problem with both the parties. In Turkey, you're seeing not quite so much focused on the entire government, but that's the nature of the protests in Brazil right now. Now, moving forward, what's going to happen, the protests will continue. There were rumors of a general strike that was supposed to happen on Monday, but the Brazil's two main unions, the Central Workers Union and the Union Force, say that they are not planning that. Instead, and I found this to be kind of interesting, they're planning a national work slowdown for July 11th, where workers will only perform strictly what's required of them on the job. Now, I understand that in some senses that seems more, I guess, reasonable and less likely to turn people against the protest movement, but it also seems much less likely to make much of a difference, I think. But look, they're the major unions. I guess they know what they're doing. Now, in response to these protests 3 weeks in, the government has made a couple of moves to try to quell some of the popular resistance to the government. Earlier, just this week, the president announced $23 billion in transportation investments, attempting possibly to undercut the initial concern of the protest movement. And also, she said that the government in the near future would be prioritizing a number of different reforms, including fiscal responsibility, the control of inflation, general political reforms, healthcare, public transport, and education. Now, similar to in Turkey, they have attempted to make some reforms there to try to take the wind out of the sails of the protest movement. I don't know if it'll be more successful in Brazil, judging by the size of the crowds and just the massive amount of anger that's been building up in that population. I kind of have my doubts that these are going to be enough to quell it. But we will continue to watch the situation in Brazil as it develops. And I guess I would have to say that as an American who rooted for the Occupy movement and was pretty disappointed when it fell apart without accomplishing much of its goals, I wish them the best.